Hello and welcome to Train Signal. You're watching video number 17, Installing and Administering Linux DHCP and DNS Server. This is part of Train Signal Fast Track CBT Video, Linux Networking and Administration. So this is our table of contents for this video. It looks pretty simplistic, but we actually have a lot to do. First, we're going to learn about installing and administering DNS Server. Then we're going to move right into our scenario where we will actually install DNS Server and the configuration management tool for DNS Server on our Linux system. Then we're going to add a new zone, add some host names, and then configure our Windows client to use that DNS Server and test it out and make sure it works. Then it's going to be the same thing essentially with DHCP Server. We're going to install DHCP Server in our scenario. We're going to create a basic scope, and then we're going to use our Windows client to test that DHCP server and make sure that our DHCP server really works. So you'll get to see all of this hands-on on a real Linux server. So let's move into DNS. Now, back in video number 13, we talked about DNS server. We covered Linux Plus Objective 3.6, which talks about how it works and editing etc hosts, host.conf, resolve.conf, and then some utilities like dig, host, and named. Named is actually the DNS name server. Dig and host are the utilities. So we covered this back in video number 13, and in this video we're going to move on to a more hands-on experience with DNS server. So you get to see actually how to install the DNS server, the configuration management tool for it, and how we're going to actually configure a scope and then use a Windows client to make sure it works. So by default, DNS server is installed, but it's not running. So if you go into add remove packages, you'll see the DNS server is checked, it's installed, but then if you go into services, you'll see that it's not running and it's not checked to start automatically when the system boots. Now when you go into the services application, the actual name of the name server is called named. So they're in alphabetical order. If you look for DNS or domain name server or something like that, you won't find it. It's actually called named, so it's in the ends. Now the Fedora Linux DNS management tool is not installed by default. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to go install it. Now it's called system config bind. Bind is another name for the DNS server in Linux. It's called bind. Now it's the best tool to use to administer Linux DNS server is the system config bind. So we're going to install it, and that's what we're going to be using to configure DNS. So let's move right into our scenario. So at the Big Sky Fishing Supply Company, you want to use your new Linux server as a DNS server. Of course, makes perfect sense. It works great as a DNS server. So to do this, we're going to install the system config bind utility using the add remove packages. That's going to be our DNS management program. Then we're going to configure DNS to point to our internet name servers if this DNS server cannot answer the request. So this is called creating a forwarder. So all that means is our Linux server will go out to the internet to our internet service provider's DNS servers to look up domain names if it doesn't know how to resolve a domain name that it's given. So typically our domain name server is going to resolve DNS names for the LAN, for our local internal network, and that's the Big Sky Fishing Supply Company. So it should be able to resolve DNS names for that domain, but when it comes to resolving internet DNS domain names, it's going to have to go out to the internet, find out the IP address for the domain name it was given, bring that back, and then hand it off to the local client. So that's called a forwarder. We're going to create a new zone, a DNS zone. We're going to add the Windows client into the DNS domain name database. We're going to configure the Linux server to go to itself for DNS. Then we're going to configure the Windows client to go to the Linux server for DNS requests, and then we're going to test it out and make sure it works. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so we're over here on our Linux server. This is the Big Sky Fishing Supply server. And I'm going to click on the servers section here, and then if you look at DNS name server, notice that it's checked. So that means it's installed. The name server is installed. It says one of two optional packages are installed. If I click on that, here's the two optional packages. The caching name server is installed, but bind change root is not. Now we don't need that package. What we need is the graphical configuration tool for DNS. So you would think it would be in here, but it's not. So if we close this out and we go down to server configuration tools and I click on optional packages there, we can see the system config bind is the very first tool. Now bind is the Linux DNS system or DNS server, and this is the graphical configuration tool for it. So if I check that there and I say close and I say apply, it says you have selected this package. Are you sure? Yes, we'll continue. Then it goes out and it starts resolving dependencies, downloading the package, and in just a second here we should have our graphical configuration tool. Now of course, just like everything else in Linux, you can go and you could administer it using text files, but for DNS especially, I don't recommend that. This tool is here and it's easy and works really well. So it downloaded it, it's updating the software, and in just a second we'll have our tool. Now the tool is going to be located up in the system area up here. Alright, there we go. Configuration or installation successfully completed. I'll say OK, and it closed out the package manager. So like I said, if you go up here to System, you go to Administration, and then you go to Server Settings, you'll see here the new Domain Name System or DNS server. If I click on that, it's going to start the DNS server configuration tool. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is to make a zone. So to make a zone, I'm going to right click on this DNS server, I'm going to click Add, then Zone. It's kind of weird here, the buttons you have to push. The first one is Class Internet, you have to say OK. Then Class Forwarding, you have to say OK. Now the zone origin is Big Sky Fishing Supply.com, and then you have to add a dot at the end of this to say that this is an absolute domain. If you don't do that, it'll just tell you that you have to and it'll add it for you. So I'll say OK. Then it brings up this new zone information for the Big Sky Fishing Supply.com. Now we need to make sure that this is correct here. And make sure that this is correct, the email address contact. So we have the authoritative name server, server 1, that's this server. Then we have the responsible person's email address, and that's root at this server. And then down here, you can't actually see the last option down here. I'm going to move the toolbar over to the right, and we're going to say tab, tab, tab to the OK button, which you can't actually see because of the resolution. And I'm going to say Enter or OK. And it added this Big Sky Fishing Supply Company zone. I just double clicked on it. You can see some properties there. You can expand it over here, and here's the authoritative zone info, the name server. So we successfully added our zone. The next thing we need to do is to add client 1. Now to add client 1, I need the IP address for the host name of client 1. So let's go and get client 1's current IP address. I'm going to go back to our Windows machine here. I'm going to open up my network adapter, go to support, and it says it's assigned by DHCP. That's our current DHCP server on this network, which is just a little Linksys router, wireless router, and the current IP address is 192.168.1.15. Let's also look at the details here because we need this information to set up a forwarder. So we have our two current DNS servers, and I'm going to write those down. We've got 68, 87, 85, 98, and 87.69.146. So I wrote those down. You see what I'm talking about here, these two DNS servers. Right here, these two. So these are the current DNS servers provided by our internet service provider. So this is the DNS servers. These are the DNS servers that our DNS server is going to use to go out to the internet and query internet DNS names. For local DNS names, it'll have its own database, but for internet DNS names, it's going to have to forward those requests out to these DNS servers. So I wrote those down because we're going to have to configure a forwarder on our local machine. But for now, let's go and let's create the hostname alias for client 1, which is going to point to this 1.15 right here. So if we go back to our Linux system, so if I go over here to the bigskyfishingsupply.com, I right click, I go to add, I go up here to A, which is an IPv4 address, that's the A. I click on that, and then under domain name, if I press home here and I type the name of the domain name we want to add, client1.bigskyfishingsupply.com. Then here I put the IP address that we found when we looked up the network connection properties. So that's the address we're going to make point to client 1. So I'm going to say OK, and then notice here, here's client 1, and it's pointing to 192.168.1.15. So we added this address that we needed to add for client 1. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to create a forwarder, or make this DNS server a forwarder. So a forwarder is a DNS server that when it receives a hostname lookup request that it cannot resolve, it forwards that to an internet domain name server. Typically it's an internet domain name server. It could actually be an internal DNS server as well. But because internet DNS servers, they sort of have the ultimate list of all the internet domain names, and if they don't have it, they can send it up to the root internet DNS servers. That's typically who you're sending or forwarding hostname resolutions to that your local DNS server cannot resolve. So to do this, I'm going to click on the DNS server icon here. I'm going to click Properties. Then on this All Options list on the right, I'm going to scroll down and I'm going to find Forwarders with an S. And I say that because there's also forward right here, but we want forwarders with an S. I'm going to click the plus, and I'm going to click IPv4 address over here. Now in the address field, we're going to put in the IP addresses of the DNS servers that our Windows client was using. So I'm going to type in 68, 87, 85, and 98. I'm going to click Apply, or I'm sorry, I'm going to click OK right here, and it's going to add it. This is a little bit of a confusing interface. It's a little busy. I'm going to click IPv4 address again over here. It clears that out, and here I'm going to type in the second address. Then I'm going to click OK right here, and notice we have our two DNS forwarders configured over here. Now I'm going to click Apply, then OK. So we configured a forwarder. Now we need to save it. I'm going to say Save, and it'll say, do you really want to back up and replace the existing DNS configuration files? I'm going to say yes. Alright, good. We created our forwarders. One last thing we need to do is create an alias for this server. So here I'm going to right click and say Add IPv4 address. This is going to be server 1. I'm going to put in the address here, 1.100, and say OK. Now we have server and client 1 both here. Now let's save again. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to configure this Linux server to use itself for DNS. So to do that, I'm going to close out the DNS management utility here. I'm going to go up to System. I'm going to go to Administration, then Network. It's going to start up the network configuration tool here. I'm going to click on the DNS tab, and here we have hostname server 1, and the primary DNS needs to be this server, 192.168.1.100. No secondary DNS. The DNS search path should be bigskyfishingsupply.com. I'm going to go up to File, and say save. It says changes are saved. You may want to restart the network and network services or restart the computer. I'm going to say OK and close this out. Now we need to start the DNS name server called named. To do this, I'm going to go to System, Administration, Server Settings, Services. We're going to scroll down here and find named. I'm going to select it to run automatically when the system boots at run level 5, and I'm going to say save. Then I'm going to say start, and we'll start our DNS server. Alright, you see some stats down here for the DNS server. So let's close this out and let's go to a command prompt. Alright, now we should be able to ping server 1, and it says it can ping server1.bigskyfishingsupply.com, and it resolved it to this IP address of our DNS server, this server. So that's good. That's good. I'm going to do Control C. Alright, now let's ping client 1. Alright, and it resolved that to 192.168.1.15. So good, good. Now I'm going to do ping www.trainsignal.com. And there we go. That was resolved to an IP address here. So that's good. It looks like we're resolving DNS names or host names to IP addresses. So it looks like from the server side, the server is functioning fine. So now let's go over to the client and let's make this server our DNS server, and then we'll test DNS from there. So to configure this client for DNS, so to configure this client to use the new Linux DNS server for DNS, I'm going to go to the properties on our network adapter right here. I'm going to double click that. I'm going to click properties. I'm going to scroll down here and find TCP/IP. Double click that. And then right now we're still set up to use DHCP to obtain our IP address and to obtain our DNS server address. Well, I'm going to change that DNS server address to not be automatic, but instead to use the new Linux DNS server, 1.100 right there, 192.168.1.100. I'm going to say OK and OK, and let's close this out. And now let's open a DOS command prompt. Alright, now let's do ipconfig/all. And we have a few weird adapters here, but if we go up and we find this wireless adapter, which is the primary adapter on this machine, you can see here's the IP address, 192.168.1.15, and then here's the DNS server here, 192.168.1.100. So that's the new Linux DNS server that we just finished configuring. So to test it out, make sure it works, first let's start off by doing a ping server 1. You see it resolved here to bigskyfishingsupply.com, and it looked up the IP address and it got a resolution. So we were able to successfully ping server 1 by name. Now let's try another one. Let's ping an internet address, www.trainsignal.com. So here we're able to look that domain name up using our new Linux DNS server, and it actually went out to our internet service provider's DNS servers. It had to forward that out, get that IP address, bring it back, and then hand it back to us, and then we were able to successfully ping it. So now we've proven that our new Linux DNS server works by using our Windows client, configuring it to point to the new Linux DNS server, and then looking up both local and internet DNS domain names. So with that, let's go back to our slides. And now we can move on to DHCP. Now let's briefly talk about installing and administering DHCP. DHCP is the Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. This protocol is what's used when your computer doesn't have an IP address, it boots up, it broadcasts across the network. It says, hey, I need an IP address. And a DHCP server responds and says, here you go, here's an IP address, here's a subnet mask, and then usually there's a default gateway, and then DNS servers that are handed out. There can even be other network configuration information handed out from a DHCP server. So DHCP is the protocol that does this, and of course it uses a DHCP client on the client and a DHCP server on the server. Now a DHCP server is included with Fedora Linux, and the name of the server is DHCPD or DHCP daemon. Now it must be installed using add remove packages. It's not installed by default. It's located under the servers and then the network servers subsection, and it's an optional component. Now there's no graphical tool included with Fedora Linux to configure DHCPD, but you could install something like webmin. Now before you start using DHCPD, you must first create a configuration file for it using a text editor. If you try to start it without creating that text file, it'll give you a warning and it won't start. Now this configuration file for DHCPD is located in Etsy, and it's called dhcpd.conf. And this file, you have to create it and configure it, type it in, everything manually. So here's an example of what you would type in this configuration file. Each of these sections here are terminated, or they're broken up, by these brackets, these squiggly brackets. So here I'm creating a new subnet, and then inside that subnet I start off with a squiggly bracket, and then I have the DHCP range of IP addresses I'm handing out, the subnet mask, the broadcast address, the default gateway, or the routers is what they call it, the domain name servers, and then the domain name search suffix. So what I've done is I've taken this configuration here already and I've put it over on our Linux server so that we can use it to create this dhcpd.conf file. So let's move on to our scenario, and we'll talk about what we'll be doing with the DHCPD server over at the Big Sky Fishing Supply Company. So for the Big Sky Fishing Supply Company, you need to use the new Linux server as a DHCP server. To do this, first we need to disable any existing DHCP server on the network. In our case, that's going to be our Linux router. Then we'll install the DHCPD server using add remove packages. We'll create the dhcpd.conf file in Etsy. Then we'll use the Windows client to test the new DHCP server. So we'll start off by disabling our existing DHCP server. To do this, I'm going to open a web browser. I'm going to go to our default gateway, which is also our DHCP server. Type in the password. We'll log in. And then right here on the very first screen, the basic setup is right here, DHCP server, enable or disable. I'm going to click disable. And this is because DHCP servers don't work together on a network. You can only have one running at a time. So I'm going to save those settings. So at this point, if a new PC started up, it would not get an IP address. So I'm going to close this out. So we disabled our existing DHCP server on the network. Now we need to install our new DHCPD server over on the Linux system. So let's go over to the Linux system. So to do this, I'm going to go up to Applications, then Add Remove Software. And this will take just a second to retrieve software information from the internet. Once it retrieves the information, we're going to go into the Servers section, then Network Servers, then do Optional Packages, and look at installing the DHCPD server. So we said Servers, then Network Servers, then Optional Packages. And right here, that checkbox is the DHCP server, a DHCP server and relay agent. There's a lot of other servers in here, by the way. There's a Radius server, there's Kerberos server, There's a streaming media server, an IRC server, all sorts of good servers in here that can be used for a variety of different tasks. A routing server to make your Linux system into a router. It's amazing all the different things you can do with Linux. So let's close this out. We check the checkbox next to the DHCP server, and I'm going to click Apply right here. It says you're installing DHCP. Are you sure? I'm going to say Continue. Yes, we're sure. Now it resolves dependencies. It looks to see if there's any other packages that are going to be required for DHCP to work. Now it's downloading the package. And then once it downloads it, it will install it. And it says software installation successfully completed. I'm going to say OK. And we successfully installed our DHCP server. It was that easy. Alright, the next thing we need to do is to open a command line prompt and create our new DHCPD configuration file. So I'm going to go to Applications, Accessories, Terminal. I'm going to CD into Etsy. And I said that I had already created a sample DHCP configuration file. That way we don't have to sit here and type it in. So if I if I ls and I pipe that to DHCP, you'll see here this dhcpd.conf.back. This is the file I created, and then there's a dhcpd.conf that was installed when the DHCP server was installed. But if you remember me saying we have to edit this, we have to create this file properly before we can start DHCPD. And let me show you why. If I cat out the dhcpd.conf file, you can see there's nothing in it really. There's 3 comment lines, but there's no actual configuration. So you have to create the configuration in this file before you can start the DHCP daemon. So let's cat out the dhcpd.conf.back file that I created, and you can see here this is the exact same thing that I had over in the slides. This is exactly what we need for the Big Sky Fishing Supply Company's new Linux DHCP server to hand out IP addresses. It points those clients to the proper domain name servers, which is this server, the Linux server, and it points those clients to the proper router, which is the default gateway they need to get out to the internet. So to put this file in place, I'm going to copy dhcpd.conf.back to dhcpd.conf. It says overwrite, yes or no. I'm going to say yes. And now let's go back and let's cat dhcpd.conf. And you can see there's our configuration we need. So to start the DHCPD server, I'm going to just type DHCPD and I'm going to put it in the background. Now this is just running the server just right in this command prompt under this shell. If you're going to run it on a production server, obviously you don't want to do this, because every time you would reboot the server you'd have to log in, run the shell, and start the DHCPD. So you really want to put it over in the services application or under something like inetd so that it would start automatically. Or you could put it in an RC script so it would start automatically when the server boots. So I'm going to press enter here, and you can see it says this is the Internet Systems Consortium DHCP server, version 3.0.3 Red Hat. Let's see, 0 leases. It's listening. And there's some other settings here that don't mean anything to me, but it's listing and it looks like it's running. So to test this out, we're going to go over to our Windows client. I'm going to go over here to the network adapter. I'm going to click on properties. I'm going to go down to TCP/IP, and I'm going to select here obtain DNS server address automatically on both of these, both for DNS and for the IP address. I'm going to say OK and OK. I'm going to go over to support, and if you click on details here, you can see our current DHCP server is 192.168.1.1. I'm going to do a repair, and what should happen is we should release that IP address and we should re-request an IP address by DHCP, but the only response we're going to get is from the new Linux DHCP server. So I'm going to say close here, and let's do a repair. So it goes through, it disables the adapter, it re-enables the adapter, connects to the wireless network in our case because we're using wireless, and then it renews our IP address, does a few other things there, and it says it finished repairing the connection. So I'm going to go down here to our adapter, double click that, go to support. Notice right here, right off, we have a new IP address, 192.168.1.239. If I click details, you can see here's the DNS server, 192.168.1.100, and the DHCP server is 192.168.1.100. And like I said, we have a new IP address, a .239 IP address. So let's test this out. Let's open a website. Let's see if all of this configuration we've done with DHCP and DNS really works. So I'm going to open my web browser, and let's type in www.trainsignal.com, and voila, we were able to bring up the Train Signal homepage. Let's try another one. Let's try google.com, and we're able to bring up Google. So we received our IP address from our Linux DHCP server. It also pointed us to our Linux DNS server, and we registered that IP address, and we're able to use both those servers to get out on the internet because we have the proper configurations and our DNS server is properly configured. So with that, let's go back to our slides. So we completed all the tasks on our scenario. We disabled the existing DHCP server, we installed the new DHCPD using add remove packages, we created the dhcpd.conf file in Etsy, and then we started our DHCP server, and we used the Windows client to test whether or not that DHCP server was really working. We received our IP address, it pointed us to the proper DNS server, and we were able to go out on the internet resolving DNS domain names through the Linux DNS server, which was actually forwarding those internet domain name server requests out to our internet service providers' DNS servers. So we completed that scenario. Let's move on to our conclusion. So in conclusion, in this video we successfully installed the DNS graphical configuration tool for Fedora Linux, and you saw how to use that to create a new zone, to configure our DNS server as a forwarder, and to create new IP address to host name address aliases. Then we went over to our Windows client and we manually configured the Windows client to use the new DNS server, and then we were able to use that DNS server to look up internet and local domain IP address to host name matches. We were able to surf the internet by using those host name resolutions that we were receiving through our new Linux DNS server, usually that was acting as a forwarder and forwarding those requests onto our internet service provider. Then with DHCP, we installed the DHCP daemon. We configured our dhcp.conf text file. We started the daemon. We went over to our Windows client and we configured it to go out and request a new IP address from the new Linux DHCP server. It received one, and we saw how all the information that we had configured in the DHCP scope was correct, and we were able to surf the internet using that DHCP information that we received from the Linux DHCP server. So with that, we learned a lot about DNS and DHCP in this video. We saw hands-on how it works, we configured it and tested it, and we've reached the end of video number 17.